Welcome, everyone, for our very last lecture in our current symposium on statecraft. Okay, my camera is not really behaving, and that's okay. So far, I mean, I think that the theme that we've been exploring has taken us through a lot of case studies of different incredible moments throughout history when people were great leaders chose not to be tragic, to fulfill their duty and recognize that their identity was tied to something greater than themselves within history, and they gave their lives to a certain common cause that expressed itself differently in various cultures and various times. But whether it's now, whether it's 2,000 years ago, or whether it's going to be 8,000 years or more into the future, certain universal principles, I think, remain constant. And these are principles that are very much tied to the interconnectedness of how the mind of each individual finite human being, whether we're living to an average life expectancy of 75 years of age today, or whether it was an average life expectancy of 45 years of age 200 years ago, or maybe 500 or 600 years, 1,000 years in the future might be what average human life expectancy is. But no matter what, we are still finite, and we do live within an environment that is relatively infinite as far as we can tell. But despite that incommensurability, we have an ability within the mind to make a leap when it's not thinking like a computer. So when the mind of human beings is not limiting itself to its senses or to abstract formulas that we don't fully understand the truthfulness of, but we just use as rules. Whenever we're binding ourselves to those ways of thinking, sensory or axiomatics assumptions, we're not able to be creative. But when we're not bound by those things and we're using a different, more potent approach, as we've seen from the studies of Plato, the Platonists, and Confucius and his followers, and many other schools around the world that had a similar sort of orientation, we are able to make these creative, incredible leaps into discovery concepts that translate into new ways of producing, of advancing our technologies, of allowing our society to have more of our population sustained at a higher quality of life, accessing more of our cognitive powers. And that's beautiful. It's a really good thing. But unfortunately, and maybe you could say fortunately, human beings are not in a vacuum. There are such things as politics that do exist. There are things as empires, oligarchs, and systems associated therewith that don't like it when we act in a natural way. And we've seen all of society sort of pervert or shaped by this perverse effort to subvert this natural maturation of human beings and human cultures. So that's been sort of a permeating idea running throughout all of our presentations. So I was very happy when Jerry had the idea of offering a certain poetic concept to really flesh out this and make it a little bit more explicit, since so far this topic has been more implicit than explicit. And by looking at some ideas that had been alive in the heart and mind of people like Shelley, Keats, and other great poets, we might have a better understanding of what is this principle that's been there this whole time, looking at us right in the face, and maybe we haven't been seeing it. So Jerry, thank you so much. It's all yours.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Matt. So first, before I start, I just want to give a short note for this presentation. For those of us who are in the Wednesday evening reading club, that's what I call it, back in February, we read Michael Billington's article on the deconstructionist assault on China's cultural optimism. And in that article, he compared the Chinese character Ren to the Greek word agape. And when we were reading that, Dr. Quan Le said he liked Billington's translation of that. And Quan also said that Ren could be thought of as enthusiasm. And I should just mention, people should watch Quan's class on Plato and Confucius, spiritual brothers at the two ends of the world island. It's very good. If you've seen it, watch it again. Anyway, so when Quan said that about Ren being like enthusiasm, I remembered having read some of Plato's dialogues where, oh, am I supposed to share screen? Okay. So anyway, when Quan was talking about Ren being translatable as enthusiasm, I remembered having read some of Plato's dialogues where he talked about enthusiasm. So I went back and I reread those dialogues about enthusiasm, and I wrote up some notes on it. And so this presentation is one attempt to discuss what Juan was saying about agape and enthusiasm. So you could call this like variations on a theme by Juan. So rediscovering Plato's and Shelley's enthusiasm. In keeping with the theme of this Rising Tide Foundation Symposium on reviving the lost art of statecraft, I would like to discuss this lost art by visiting two other symposiums, by Plato and by Percy Shelley. Now, Plato you know about from watching Cynthia's class on Plato's fight against the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. So the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley has an interesting connection to America that I'd like to point out. Now, his grandfather, Bysshe Shelley, was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1731. And he lived for a while in the United States before his parents moved back to England. Many years later, in 1806, he would become Sir Bysshe Shelley, the Baronet of Castle Gorn. Now, Percy Shelley's father, Timothy Shelley, was an elected member of Parliament for West Sussex when Percy was born in 1792. Now, although Percy may have stood to inherit his grandfather's baronetcy and perhaps his father's seat in Parliament, nonetheless, Percy's views concerning the Republican experiment in the United States can be seen in the following quote from Leon and Cisna for The Revolution of the Golden City.
Make sure you switch the slide. Make sure you switch the slide.
Okay, I've been told by Madeline to do something, but now Shelley's poem of a revolution in ideas, it was suppressed by the publishers and it had to be revised by removing 27 canceled pages, and he had to add a new title and called it The Revolt of Islam, which had nothing to do with Islam, but the tyrant in the poem was modeled on an Ottoman sultan, so that it had no resemblance to a British monarch in order to pass the censors. So I'll just read you a quote from that poem. There is a people mighty in its youth, a land beyond the oceans of the West, where, though with rudest rites, freedom and truth are worshipped, from a glorious mother's breast, who, since high Athens fell, among the rest sate like the queen of nations, but in woe, by inbred monsters, outraged and oppressed, turns to her chainless child for succor now. It draws the milk of power in wisdom's fullest flow. That land is like an eagle whose young gaze feeds on the noontide beam, whose golden plume floats moveless on the storm, and in the blaze of sunrise gleams when earth is wrapped in gloom. An epitaph of glory for the tomb of murdered Europe, may thy fame be made, great people. As the sand shalt thou become. Thy growth is swift as morn when night must fade. The multitudinous earth shall sleep beneath thy shade. Yes, in the desert there is built a home for freedom. Genius is made strong to rear the monuments of man beneath the dome of a new heaven. Myriads assemble there, whom the proud lords of man in rage or fear drive from their wasted homes. The boon, I pray, is this, that Sithna shall be convoyed there. Nay, start not at the name, America. Now, in that, Leon, who's speaking, speaks of a land where freedom and truth are worshipped, of the power and wisdom's fullest flow, of an eagle floating moveless when earth is wrapped in gloom, of murdered Europe where proud lords in rage or fear drive their people from their wasted homes. Now, in this, he's offering to surrender himself to the Sultan's police in order to allow Sithna to escape to America. Now, it should be noted that Shelley wrote this defense of America a few years after the ending of the War of 1812 between the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, I want to show that not only was Shelley a Republican by just showing his support for the idea of the Republican America, but that he was also a Republican by showing his understanding and agreement with Plato's Republic. Now, his friend and fellow student, Thomas Hogg, writes about their early years together at Oxford. And this is a quote from the life of Percy Shelley that he wrote. It seems laughable, but it is true that our knowledge of Plato was derived solely from Dacier's translation of a few of the dialogues and from an English version of that French translation. We had never attempted a single sentence in the Greek. So they were reading an English translation from the French, which was a translation from the Latin and a translation from the Greek. So you could see why they wanted to learn Greek. Since that time, however, I believe few of our countrymen have read the golden works of that majestic philosopher in the original language more frequently and more carefully than ourselves, and few, if any, with more profit than Shelley. Although the source whence flowed our earliest taste of the divine philosophy was scanty and turbid, the draught was not the less grateful to our lips. Our zeal in some measure atoned for our poverty. Shelley was never weary of reading or of listening to me whilst I read passages from the dialogues contained in this collection, and especially from the Phaedra. And he was vehemently excited by the striking doctrines which Socrates unfolds. So in 1818, the same year that the Platonic Republican Shelley rewrote his Revolt of Islam, Shelley left England, never to return. And he traveled to Italy, where he entered into an amazingly productive period of his writing. Many of his best poems, like To a Skylark, Ode to the West Wind, his political play, Swellfoot the Tyrant, and the poem Mask of Anarchy, which is known for its idea of non-violence and was often quoted by Mahatma Gandhi, who very much liked that poem. He also wrote a poem, Peter Bell III, that criticized William Wordsworth, and it made fun of Immanuel Kant. In Italy, he wrote Prometheus Unbound, a play, which was an attempt to finish the lost second part of Aeschylus's Prometheus poem. And he also did his own translations of Plato's dialogues, the Ion and the Symposium. And continuing in that creative burst, he wrote an essay in defense of poetry in 1821, 1 year before he died. Now, in this essay, In Defense of Poetry, Shelley considers Plato to be a poet, a sort of philosopher poet, you could say. Just as Shelley also considered Shakespeare, Dante, and Milton to be, quote, philosophers of the very loftiest power. So he has quite a comprehensive idea of a poet and philosopher. And I'll just show you a quote from that so you get an idea of his idea of a poet. Poets are not only the authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture, and statuary and painting. They are the institutors of laws and the founders of civil society and the inventors of the arts of life and the teachers who draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and the true. That partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world, which is called religion. Now, I highlighted that partial apprehension of the invisible world because we're going to be talking about it later. Now, at the end of this essay is a famous quote, which I'll just read. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. Poets are the hierophants. A hierophant is a chief priest of the mysteries. Poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So that's Shelley's comprehensive idea of a poet. And I bolden that unapprehended inspiration too, because we're gonna look further into that and the one from the earlier quote, partial apprehension of the invisible world. Now, to do that, I'm going to look at a trilogy of Plato's dialogues, the Ion, the Phaedras, and the Symposium, without discussing in detail the whole dialogue, but using a few key passages, sort of like cherry picking, but it'll demonstrate the point. But I would recommend that people read these dialogues on their own for a better understanding of it. Now, as I said, Shelley did a translation of the Ion, and it was published 20 years after his death. And there's the book there, his wife published that. So the Ion dialogue first. This is where Socrates is congratulating Ion, the rhapsodist. He recites and sings poetry, because he had just won the chief prize in the trial of skill of the Muses' art. Socrates is envious of the rhapsodists, who are conversant in the works of many excellent poets, but especially of Homer, who Socrates calls the best and most divine. And they learn not merely his verses, but also his meaning. Now, Socrates asks Ion if, as well as being a master at explaining Homer, he is also a master at explaining other poets like Hesiod and Archilochus. But Ion replies no, that his powers are confined only to Homer. So Socrates and Ion now begin a discussion of art, whether the art of painting or sculpting or music or poetry. That if someone is able to understand this art, then their way of considering and criticizing all the professors of this art and their judgment in each case would depend on the principles of this art. And if they can know which compositions are better, they can also know which compositions are not. Now, Socrates reasons that it was because Ion wasn't capable of explaining Homer on these principles of art or for real science, that therefore his ability must come from some divine power. Now, some people think that Socrates is making fun of Ion because he can't explain what makes Homer better than other, and that he doesn't know anything about poetry there. But that's not what Socrates is doing. He really wants to know why when Ion falls asleep whenever some other poet is being recited or talked about. But if Homer is being talked about, he's totally engaged, and he ends up winning all the competitions for reciting and explaining Homer. So sometimes we see that in ourselves, you know. If we're really excited about something, we get right into it. And every little detail, nothing is too small, nothing is too insignificant because we want to know. And other times, if we're not interested in something, forget it. You know, wild horses, you know, cannons going off, red lights, nothing is going to get you excited about that thing. So I kind of sympathize with Ion. I kind of find myself the same with that. So here's a quote from the Ion, and I'm going to ask Madeline if she will read that. She's going to be my Socrates today. Okay. There you go, Socrates.
Okay, there, mister. I will tell you, O Ion, what appears to me to be the cause of this inequality of power. It is that you are not master of any art for the illustration of Homer, but it is a divine influence which moves you, like that which resides in a stone called magnet. For not only does this stone possess the power of attracting iron rings, but it can communicate to them the power of attracting other rings, so that you may see sometimes a long chain of rings and other iron substances attached and suspended one to the other by this influence. And as the power of the stone circulates through all the links of this series and attaches each to each, so the muse, communicating through those whom she has first inspired, to all others capable of sharing in the inspiration, the influence of that first enthusiasm, creates a chain and a succession. For the authors of those great poems which we admire do not attain to excellence through the rules of any art, but they utter their beautiful melodies of verse in a state of inspiration, and as it were, possessed by a spirit not their own.
So Socrates is saying that someone who wants to be a poet must deal with inspiration, not with logical reason. That true poets do not compose their verses according to the rules of art, like the medicinal art or the gymnastic art, or like an architect or a builder. That is art that is based on the understanding of physical principles, but that the muse inspires poets through, he calls it a divine impulse, inspiring others like a magnet to form a chain of divine enthusiasts. Now, we need to better understand what this divine impulse of the muses is that can inspire us. So we're going to look at the Phaedras dialogue. Now, I just want to show you, this is a portrait of Thomas Taylor. And for some unknown reason, this portrait hangs in the National Gallery of Art in Ottawa, in Canada. I don't know why it's there, but I saw it there, so I know it exists. Now, Thomas Taylor's important because The first English translation of Plato's complete dialogues and letters were published by Thomas Taylor in 1804. It had actually been started by another gentleman, Floyer Sydenham, but he died in debtor's prison in 1787. He had translated 9 of the dialogues, including the Ion and the Symposium that Shelley translated. And in 1792, the same year that Percy Shelley was born, Taylor published his first translation of one of Plato's dialogues, which was the Phaedras dialogue. So now, secondly, we're going to look at the Phaedras dialogue, where Socrates and Phaedras, they're talking about love. When Socrates is agitated by the fury of the nymphs, as he says, and he realizes that so far their discourses have been foolish and impious, as if they sounded like men educated in ships. I just laugh when I ever hear that. But my apologies to those people who worked on ships or worked in the Navy. But men educated in ships. Socrates is referring to Book 6 in the Republic, where he talks about a ship, and the pilot of the ship is deaf and he's half blind. So the sailors imagine that each of them should be the pilot, though they never learned the art. And they claim that the art itself cannot be taught, and that the true pilot is only a stargazer. He's insignificant and isn't profitable to them, but somehow they can replace him. Anyway, that's what he means by men educated in ships. Okay, so Socrates is agitated by the fury of the nymphs when he realizes their talk has been foolish and impious. To understand this idea of fury of the nymphs are the Erinyes. If you remember back to the class by Dr. Petra, and he did the trilogy of Aeschylus, the Oresteia, and through Athena, the Erinyes were changed from seekers of justice through revenge, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, into what were called the kindly ones, of a new compassionate form of justice. So people should watch that class, Dr. Petra. It was very good. Also, Matt's class discussed this same new kind of justice, the principle of Westphalia, to give you an idea. Anyway, getting back to Socrates, having now finally been agitated by the Erinyes, Socrates now presents a new oration, a new metaphorical oration.
The greatest goods are produced for us through mania and are assigned to us by divine gift. Such of the ancients as gave names to things did not consider mania as either base or disgraceful, but as something beneficial when it subsists through a divine allotment.
Now, some people have translated this word mania as madness or insanity, but Socrates sees it as something different, something beneficial. Kepler also refers to mania as, he calls it inspired frenzy. So, next.
For the predicting prophetess at Delphi and the priestess in Dodona have, when insane, procured many advantages, both privately and publicly, to the Greeks. But when they have been in a prudent state, they have been the cause of very trifling benefits, or indeed of none at all.
So he's talking about the oracles. And so this is one type of mania, which is used by the prophetesses and priestesses to predict, is called prophecy, but the moderns called it mantic. So that's the first type. of mania.
Indeed, the investigations of futurity by prudent men, which take place through birds and a variety of other tokens, as proceeding from the Dionysic part through human intelligence, they denominated intellect and intellective opinion.
So Socrates is saying this is the second type of mania, which is used by men to investigate the future using omens and different signs. And this is called augury. So it's distinct from that first type, the man type.
But the third species is a possession and mania descending from the Muses, which, receiving a soul tender and solitary, rouses and agitates it with Bacchic fury, according to odes and other species of poetry, in consequence of which, by adorning the infinite actions of antiquity, it becomes the means of instructing posterity. But he who approaches to the poetic gates without the mania of the Muses, persuading himself that he can become a poet in a manner perfectly from art alone, will, both as to himself and his poetry, be imperfect, since the poetry which is produced by prudence vanishes before that which is the progeny of mania. It must now be shown by us that a mania of this kind was sent by the gods for the purpose of producing the greatest felicity.
So this third type of mania that comes to us from the muse is what he calls poetic enthusiasm. Forget the first two. This is what we're looking at. Socrates is distinguishing poetry that merely excites our senses and that is imperfect from poetry that inspires our souls, that instructs posterity, and produces the greatest happiness. Now, Socrates then goes on to discuss this third mania with another metaphor about the soul.
Let it then be similar to the kindred power of a winged chariot and charioteer. All the horses and chariots of the gods are indeed good, and composed from things good, but those of other natures are mixed. And in the first place, our principal part governs the reins of its two-yoked car. In the next place, one of the horses is good and beautiful, and is composed from things of this kind. But the other is of a contrary nature, and is composed of contrary qualities. And on this account, our course is necessarily difficult and hard.
Yes, he's saying the horses and the chariots of the gods are good, and they proceed with easy motion. But those of the other natures, our souls, proceed with difficulty and labor, because one of our horses is good, but the other is not. So we have this contrary nature in us. So he's alluding to the idea that our souls, other natures, are both mortal and immortal. You could look at the horses and chariots that way. One of the horses is immortal and one is mortal. And that's what makes us different from the gods. Now, Zeus was leading this divine procession, and he followed by the army of all the other gods and demons and all the other souls.
But those who are denominated immortals, when they arrive at the summit, proceeding beyond the extremity of heaven, stand on its back. And while they are established in this eminence, the circumference carries them around, and they behold what the region beyond the heavens contains. But with respect to other souls, it is disturbed by the course of the horses, and scarcely obtains the vision of perfect realities. But the other souls at one time rise, and at another time depress the head of the charioteer, and through the violence of the horses, they partly see indeed and are partly destitute of vision.
So the gods with the two immortal horses, they're actually able to reach the top of heaven and to see what we call absolutes, right? Perfect beauty, perfect truth, perfect goodness. But those of us who have one immortal horse and one mortal horse, we're like bobbing up and down. We don't get glimpse of the true reality. So we get a tiny little glimpse and then we're back down. Then we pop up, see a little bit and pop down. So we don't, this is his metaphor of the difference between the gods and us souls. So only the gods can reach the extremity of heaven and behold what the region beyond heaven contains, while the other souls going up and down see only a glimpse of this place of perfect reality. And through this tumult, the contest and perspiration of trying but not being able to accomplish this vision, they must depart and they fall back again to the earth. And these souls inform the body of men. And they're placed in different ranks, different orders, according to the amount of their perception of that vision. So people who got a little more of a glimpse go higher up on the order of people, and people who barely got a glimpse go to the lower orders. And he says, the soul which has seen the most informs the body of a philosopher, or of one desirous of beauty, or of a musician, or of one devoted to love. And this philosopher, this lover of beauty, will become filled with a kind of mania, a divine enthusiasm.
The means by which anyone, on perceiving a portion of terrene beauty, from their soul's reminiscence of that which is true, may recover his wings, and when he has recovered them, may struggle to fly away. This enthusiasm, therefore, is of all enthusiasms the best. And he who is under the influence of this mania, when he loves beautiful objects, is denominated a lover.
So when this philosopher or someone who loves beauty sees something beautiful on earth, it reminds him of that glimpse he had of perfect beauty, perfect reality. And so the soul of this philosopher, the soul of this poet, when it's filled with this divine enthusiasm, becomes a lover of beauty, because it's searching for that perfect beauty that it once caught a glimpse of. Now, we need to look at what is this love of beauty. And to do that, we're going to look at a third dialogue, the symposium. And you can actually get a copy, a paperback of the Symposium of Plato, translated by Percy Shelley. This is one I saw on the internet, so I just took a picture to show you. So this one's easily seen. Now, this third dialogue, the Symposium dialogue, is where a gathering of Athenians are giving orations to love. And Socrates, in his turn, talks of his being examined and lectured by the prophetess Diotima, who showed that love was not a god, but a daemon. Now, in many of the dialogues, Socrates speaks of his daemon, and we shouldn't be confused by today's use of the word demon, which means something that's bad, like an evil spirit. But for Socrates, he speaks of daemons as something that is good. So it could be more comparable to, say, an angel. And perhaps your particular daemon could be your guardian angel, or as being your muse, or your conscience. So that's the idea of daemon that Socrates uses, distinguished from demon.
He is neither mortal nor immortal, but something intermediate. A great daemon, Socrates, and everything demoniacal, holds an intermediate place between what is divine and what is mortal. He interprets and makes a communication between divine and human things, conveying the prayers and sacrifices of man to the gods, and communicating the commands and directions concerning the mode of worship most pleasing to them from gods to man. He fills up that intermediate space between these two classes of beings so as to bind together by his own power the whole universe of things. These daemons are indeed many and various, and one of them is love.
So that's Socrates' idea of the daemon, but it's also this idea that you have the immortal world and the mortal world, but there's something in between that connects the two of them. And this is the point in a lot of dialogues Plato makes, this in-betweenness. Now, Socrates then goes on to show how philosophy is this intermediate state between ignorance and wisdom. Wisdom, he says, is one of the most beautiful of all things. So, since love thirsts for the beautiful, love must be a philosopher.
The case stands thus. No god philosophizes or desires to become wise, for he is wise. Nor, if there exists any other being who is wise, does he philosophize. Nor do the ignorant philosophize, for they desire not to become wise. For this is the evil of ignorance, that he who has neither intelligence nor virtue nor delicacy of sentiment imagines that he possesses all those things sufficiently. He seeks not, therefore, that possession of whose want he is not aware. Who then, O Diotima, are philosophers, if they are neither the ignorant nor the wise? It is evident even to a child that they are those intermediate persons among whom is love. For wisdom is one of the most beautiful of all things. Love is that which thirsts for the beautiful, so that love is of necessity a philosopher. Philosophy being in an intermediate state between ignorance and wisdom.
So that's Socrates' idea of philosophy, this in-betweenness between ignorance and wisdom. Now, when Socrates talks about philosophers, he's not talking about the so-called philosophers at that time, the sophists, because they only use their rules, their axioms, their postulates, and their uninspired search for knowledge. And Socrates liked to ridicule and point out the flaws and inconsistencies in their arguments. No, Socrates is talking about the philosopher poets and their divinely inspired search for knowledge. Now, Socrates asks Diotima, if all this is true, then of this philosopher love, what advantages does he afford to man? Diotima then asks, why is love the love of beautiful things? And she answers, for we select a particular species of love and apply to it distinctively the appellation of that which is universal. And she gives, as an example, poetry.
Poetry, which is a general name signifying every cause whereby anything proceeds from that which is not into that which is, so that the exercise of every inventive art is poetry, and all such artists, poets. Yet they are not called poets, but distinguished by other names. And one portion or species of poetry, that which has a relation to music and rhythm, is divided from all others, and known by the name belonging to all. But this is alone properly called poetry. And those who exercise the art of this species of poetry, poets. So with respect to love, love is indeed universally all that is earnest desire for the possession of happiness and that which is good, the greatest and the subtlest of love, and which inhabits the heart of every living being. But those who seek this object through the acquirement of wealth or the exercise of the gymnastic arts or philosophy are not said to love, nor are called lovers. One species alone is called love, and those alone are said to be lovers and to love, who seek the attainment of the universal desire through one species of love, which is particularly distinguished by the name belonging to the whole, but love nothing but that which is good.
Yes, Socrates is talking about the love of the good, and poetry is part of that. And for Socrates, poetry isn't something to just meditate upon or to admire without a purpose. That's like staring at our belly buttons. And staring at our belly buttons does not make us skilled in naval intelligence, as they say. Sorry for that. That's the men educated in ships again. But Socrates says that love has to have a purpose, a cause, a principle, a reason for this divine enthusiasm, which he calls the good. Well, Socrates is indisposed. You want me to read?
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Can we then simply affirm that men love that which is good? What then must we not add? That in addition to loving that which is good, they love that it should be present to themselves. And not merely that it should be present, but that it should ever be present. Love then is collectively the desire in man that good should be forever present to them.
So Socrates is now saying that this love of the good also has an addition, a desire for the ever presence of the good. Because, as Socrates had earlier said, love is a daemon, a philosopher. It's intermediate between wisdom and ignorance, intermediate between immortal and mortal. So it's not perfect, but it's always trying to become more perfectible, to become better. And therefore, this love of the good, or agape, as some say, it also needs this desire for the good. And this desire we call hope. So our enthusiasm to do good, our ren, is both a love and a hope for the good. Now, we saw this idea of the good earlier in Sam's class on A City on the Hill about Cotton Mather. And I just wanted to read a small little quote from Essays to Do Good by Cotton Mather in 1710. It is an invaluable honor to do good. It is an incomparable pleasure, A man must look upon himself as dignified and gratified by God when an opportunity to do good is put into his hands. He must embrace it with rapture as enabling him directly to answer the great end of his being. So Cotton Mather totally understood the same thing that Socrates did. For Cotton Mather, his idea of rapture was enthusiasm, enthusiasm to do good. And as we saw in Sam's class, this enthusiasm had a profound impact on both Benjamin Franklin and on the ideals of the American Revolution. And in thinking of that quote, it reminded me of a gathering I attended once to celebrate the birthday of Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King. And Reverend James Bevel was speaking at the time. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with James Bevel, you can watch the movie Selma. That's about the march from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama and the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The Edmund Pettus Bridge. That bridge was named after the founder of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama, to kind of give you an irony of the whole thing. Now, in that movie, Bevel is the young organizer. He always wears these farmer's coveralls, you know, over his shoulders, and that's Bevel. So anyway, Bevel, Reverend Bevel is explaining that, well, if God put us on this earth, not only to have fun, but to do good, then God must truly love this generation. For look at all the work he's given us, all that needs to be done in the world today, for all the opportunity for us to do good. I thought that was interesting. Then he was speaking about Dr. King and how Dr. King is the best example of the idea that the real work that we do in life happens after we've done. Well, I just about fell off my chair when he said that, because it really got me thinking that the ideas that we leave behind can continue to do work, to do good, by inspiring some of those who come after us, just like Plato's metaphor of the magnet of enthusiasm that we saw in the Ion dialogue. Now, lastly, I just want to give you an example from a recent discovery to give you a better idea of this. Now, this is a picture of discovered calcite crystals by Dr. Jane Wilkins, who, by the way, is a Canadian. I just had to add that. But on April 1st of this year, an article appeared in all the major world press of the announcement of an archaeological discovery that was made at an ancient rock shelter at Galmohana Hill in the Kalahari Basin in the Republic of South Africa, which is one of the cradles of civilization. Very important finds. Now, the finds of stone tools and animal bones and other signs of human occupation were dated to 105,000 years ago, a long time. But they also included the discovery of 22 small white calcite crystals. And the big question was, why were these crystals found at this site? They weren't used for tools or for any practical purpose. For example, to help get a meal or to get water. But Dr. Wilkins suggested or guessed that these crystals were likely kept for the same reason that people are attracted to crystals today, for their visual beauty. That 100,000 years ago, one of our ancestors kept these crystals because they looked beautiful. And I really love that idea. So I wanted to thank that doctor for finding those crystals, but I also would like to thank the person who left them so long ago for us to find. Because this should remind us of how our enthusiasm can change us from being like hunters and gatherers of practical pleasure to becoming like explorers and discoverers of beauty. Now, in Plato's Republic, Socrates and Glaucon are discussing. Glaucon is Plato's older brother, who puts him in that dialogue. They're discussing whether to allow poets into the Republic. So now I think we should propose that if, it's a big if, it's conditional, if our poets are able to use this enthusiasm to give us a small glimpse of true beauty, of true wisdom, and of true happiness, then we shall allow these poets into our Republic. And I think we should allow Shelley and Plato into our Republic. And if, that's another big if our poets are able to use this enthusiasm to inspire the citizens of our Republic to do good, then I think we could make an addition to Shelley's last sentence in his defense of poetry, where he said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And perhaps we could change it to this. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of enthusiasm of the world. And I just added this little picture in there just to shake things up a bit. This is a painting by Ulysses Grant when he was 20 years old. So a lot of people underestimate the mind and the enthusiasm of this person. I'm not going to say more of this painting because I understand Martin soon will be giving us a class on Ulysses Grant. So, but it just shows you the mind who could draw that painting. Maybe why he helped win the Civil War. So I hope that this presentation may help in a small way to revive that lost art of statecraft, and also that this may help us, like all the other speakers in this symposium series, maybe to become a rising tide of enthusiasm. I think Cynthia will. Okay, so that's it for me. Let's open it up for questions and comments, and I don't know how to get out of this, but I'm going to try.
Jerry, that was wonderful. Thank you enormously. And that's a really great plug for next week's class that will be given by Martin Seif too. I'm sure he's going to enjoy your choice of ending.
Oh, good. I hope so.
I didn't know that Ulysses S. Grant was a painter. I mean, I remember that you mentioned something briefly about that, but do you know who he was influenced by, or?
Well, his teacher was a man, I put it on the last, Robert Ware. Now, for those who don't know Robert Ware, he was one of the founders of what's called the Hudson River School of Painting. So there you go, Matt. There's your Hudson River School. Ulysses Grant was a member, huh? No, at this point, you had to study perspective, right? What if you're in the field and you want to draw a map, of the battle, or you want to draw of something you needed someone to build for you, right? So you have to have this confident conception of perspective, but it also means developing art, developing a love for beauty. War is not just about destroying things, it's about saving beauty. You can look at it that way. So I don't want to say too much, but that's Ulysses Grant, a member of the Hudson River School of Painting, as were all great painters in America.
Do we have any other questions or thoughts that are pressing on people's minds?
Any comments, criticism? But remember, sorry, no refunds.
No, it was a great presentation, Jerry.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Bob.
Got a message here from Stephen, who has a thought he'd like to share.
What's it
Very-
saying? It's not about my criticizing of men in ships. Go
Well,
ahead,
I'm
Steve.
ex-Air Force, so you're always welcome to criticize sailors as far as I'm concerned. Hopefully the background noise is not too much. I'm at a cafe. The one thought I had, and what I really enjoyed about your lecture, Jerry, and certainly I think Matt alluded to that, is how you kind of tied into the broader theme of what I see coming out of Rising Tide. So the link between Shelley and Plato and Kant and Mather, and I remember Sam's lecture, so I quite enjoyed that, and it brought to mind Kwan's wonderful lecture on Plato and Confucius, and Cynthia's wonderful lectures on Plato, and I see not just an equation, you know, in the world of our existence, but I'm starting to get a perception of the broader matrix of what Rising Tide is all about and what all these great thinkers are about. And I found your lecture was another piece of that puzzle for me. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And because it's starting to all tie together for me now, I really am at this point where I can start to appreciate more of these sort of lectures. So thanks for the work you put into that, Jerry. I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. Yes, it's you start to see the connection in their thinking. It's so similar, especially what Kwan did in comparing Plato with Confucius, because like I think most people in the West here, they don't teach us anything about China or the Chinese classics or Chinese philosophy. But when you start seeing the similarities to what we know here, it gives us a better understanding of the rest of the world, I think.
Exactly. And if you think to some other lectures, and you think about the whole Plato to, I'll say, Leibniz to Vattel to the US founding fathers, there's such a fantastic intellectual framework and foundation to build on. And certainly, as Kwan has been bringing to our attention, there's an analogous body of thought from the Chinese civilization, classical thought. And certainly it's a worthy endeavor for West and East to look to seek to integrate that into a more unified and more global body of knowledge and theory. So not to wax eloquent and all that rubbish, but just that's really, I guess, more from a meta perspective, what your lecture just brought to my mind. I quite enjoyed it because of that. So thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, on that note, for anyone who's had a chance to read Mencius, Kwan has led the last 3 weeks where we've been working through one of the most interesting dialogues of Mencius that I've ever encountered, where he makes it very explicit that there is an importance in music and the ability to appreciate and judge harmony and beautiful music as part of statecraft in a mature, well-disciplined ruler. Knowing that also that if you are not able to identify that harmony in the external world, you're not able to have that internal balance within yourself to be able to judge wisely what is the right path or the wrong path for your society. And that was, again, just to amplify the Eastern insight into this very same thing. And what you're able to get across, Jerry, that poetry, this poetic principle, is not simply in the formal idea of poetry. It's something which, as Shelley said, is expressed in philosophy, in music, in architecture, in everything where a creative impulse is required to advance the art, not just to perform the art, but to advance it, is very good. And how it's all tied to politics and the emancipation of humanity is very, very important. I think you did this really well.
Yeah, the connection to politics is, I didn't go into it at all, but it struck me when Cynthia was doing her class on the Leibniz-Clark correspondence debate, that all of the letters by Clark seem less to try to justify his philosophy and more to justify the empire. So that you've developed, first of all, a concept of how you think man should be governed and run, and then you develop a philosophy to justify it. And for Plato and a lot of these thinkers, it was the idea of the Philosopher King. And you can justify that reading the dialogues and reading Confucius too. The last reading we did of Mencius, there was a brilliant thing. They were talking about the idea of timeliness. That Mencius was against these rules, all these rules for all these different situations. He was more concerned about developing your character. For example, like, what if you come to some place in life where you've got to make a decision and you've never seen this before? This is a new experience for you. You don't know what to do. There's no rule, there's no textbook to look up. How should I respond? You have to rely on your character, rely what's in your soul, what you're made of. And it really struck me with Mencius. It's the same thing you see in Plato, or another thing. If you don't mind me rattling on, is there anyone else who wants to ask a question? Or I was watching this video of you, Matt, and you were with Zain Khan show, and you were with the philosopher from Pakistan. I can't remember his name, Manan. And so Zain was talking about who's the atheist that they really promote all the time now?
Oh, not Richard Dawkins.
Yes. Is that it?
Dawkins?
I think it was. So Zane's saying the problem, he comes on and he starts all his lectures by telling people, why is such a stupid question? Stop asking why. All you need to ask is how. And when you start thinking about it, well, there's nothing wrong with how. How's a good question. But how is only going to give you, the connectedness between things and how to, you can be a good engineer by asking how. But to be a philosopher, you got to ask why. What's the purpose of this? What's the reason for it? Because to get at the in-betweenness that Plato talks about, you have to ask why. You got to find the principle, the connection between the mortal and immortal. That's what you're trying to figure out. Because we can't know true beauty. We can't know true wisdom. Only the gods do. But we can know this in-between one, where we can see if it's getting better or getting worse. And the way you do it, Plato says, is you look for the purpose, the reason that connects it. You ask why. So I thought it was amazing. This guy Dawkins is screaming, stop asking why. Only ask how. Be like Aristotle. Only ask how. Don't be like Plato, Socrates. Don't be like Confucius. Don't ask why. I thought that was hilarious in that video you did, Matt. I got a lot out of that one. So I just wanted to add that in too. It ties everything in. The people who are creating such a mess in the world, they know this stuff.
Sam says, as an engineer, I could not agree more, Jerry.
Oh, we got it from an engineer. Okay, great. He knows what I mean. You've got to ask why to get at the fundamentals.
Right.
Just wanted to say
Jerry, thank
oh, go ahead. Yeah, well, you go ahead, Mark.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead. Okay. Thank you for this outstanding lecture. And I like very much the fact that you introduced two new synonyms, one from Kepler for the frenzy inspiration, and of course the classical one by Socrates himself, the mania from his daimon or demon, according to how you pronounce the word. And I think you nailed it. One of the recurrent themes or discussion of our little group is precisely that rationalistic utilitarianism, or Aristotle or Sun Tzu, if you want, is not at all divine inspiration or enthusiasm or agape or run precisely. I think it's not far-fetched to say that you deal probably with the core or the main theme of our group, okay? Because of what you just said, okay? How is important, of course, but how is subordinate to why, because why is more encompassing than how, and it doesn't mean that how is not important, as you said very well. Thanks again.
Oh, thank you, Quan. It was your discussion of it that got me thinking on all of this. So it's thank you too. You're a doctor of enthusiasm.
Oh, thank you. That's the ultimate cure for all mental disease.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Jerry. And Juan, you're really are that poet philosopher King, and you remind me of that very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Satomi.
So tell me, did you have a question for Jerry as well?
It's more of a comment that, yeah, I mean, just I love just that, how he describes the poet just as a lover, and love being the bridge between the divine and the earth, and the poet brings that through his language and poetry to do that. And we, this group here, really, we are, I see that we're the philosophers, the poets, exactly the ones Shelley described. And that's just a pleasure to be here among such distinguished poets. So thank you.
You're welcome. We're trying to be like magnets, of enthusiasm and connect it up. Yes. But when you read Plato, you realize it is very simple. I'm reading this book now by this horrible person, but he writes on Plato's idea, and I thought this would be a great book. I'm going to read it. And the more you read it, the more you discover what he's trying to do is describe Plato from Aristotle's viewpoint. And he's dividing this in categories and this and that, and it's all mumbo jumbo, and it's so confusing. When I just wanted a book that had explaining Plato from Plato's standpoint, because it's very simple. It's not difficult to read. Some of the translations are. I mean, it wasn't till 1804 when we finally got an English translation of this. It wasn't until the Renaissance in Italy that we got the Latin translation of Plato's dialogues. It's really they've been kept away from people for a long time. Even to today, you probably have most philosophy professors are teachers of Aristotle. They may try to teach Plato, but they're doing it from Aristotle's standpoint. And that's the best thing is now we can just go read it ourselves. That's what we do at our Wednesday evening reading club. We read it and discuss it. And every time we have one of these reading sessions, I go back and I want to rewrite my whole presentation because I've learned something new that I want to use. So I probably rewrote my class maybe about 10 times. You keep learning something new all the time, and then you replace your old idea of it with something that you think is better. And that's what Socrates kept doing. Just looking for something better.
Maybe I want to, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Quan.
Maybe I want to add something else, okay? Because there is one of the civilization that is not very served well in the West, in my mind, is the Indian civilization. Because most of the presentation of Indian philosophy tend to associate it with relaxation techniques called meditation and so on. And I think it's very unfair to Indian civilization because they have also a deep philosophical investigation on the why of things, and they have also a deep understanding in the need for divine inspiration to have access to precisely to that true realm of reality, rather than the famous or the infamous rationalistic utilitarianism, which is, and that beautiful Indian philosophy now is reduced a little bit in the mainstream kingdom, if you want, to that rationalistic utilitarianism with the yoga classes on how to relax and how to meditate in inverted commas. And precisely, I would say that if I have the occasion in the future, I would certainly would like to present a little bit on Indian civilization.
That would be wonderful. Yes, I'd like to hear that.
Absolutely. I would love to hear that. I actually, Kwan, maybe we could have a small discussion about this sooner than later, but I purchased some Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore books the other day, and I've just been reading The Religion of Man, and the concepts that he's introducing in Vedic scripture that are it's in parallel to such a high degree with a lot of these transcendental concepts that we've been encountering from either the Chinese or the European, Greek, ancient traditions. There's so many parallels that he's tapping into. And I think, maybe we could incorporate some of this into a future Wednesday night reading group or a class on this topic would be wonderful.
Yeah, and it would goes with one of our themes, meaning the eternal man. Okay, the eternal man is at the core the same everywhere on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
So now I prefer to say the eternal religion rather than the universal religion, because I'm a little bit cynical sometimes, because you know the expression that the universal religions is a sect who became successful. And so it's maybe better to say eternal religion, like eternal man.
Right. Well, yeah, you could either introduce something universal by looking for something which actually is true for all things, or you could also inversely try to make the case by reducing anything potent in all systems of thought and say we're all equal in that we deny the existence of truth, and thus we're all ecumenically equal, which really just destroys any potency within any branch of religious thought that could make the foolish decision to adopt that view of universality.
Yeah, and an image comes to my mind, because that kind of mix between teachings is like you want to play tennis with the rules of football, for example. If you make the comparison between the evolution of awareness as the practice of sports, if you mix different kind of specific teachings for eternal religion, it's the same as if you mix the rules for football when playing tennis. It would give no result.
So, if Jerry, do you have any parting thoughts to leave us with before we get back to our week's work and meet up again next week?
No, I think that's it for me. I've talked out, but I would just encourage more people, if they can, to come to our Wednesday evening reading club. I'm really putting in a plug for that, but because you really see the similarities. It was like we were reading Max Planck, and from there we went and read Leibniz, because he was talking about Leibniz, and then in Leibniz he was talking about Plato's Phaedo dialogue. So then we went and read Plato, and you see how all these thinkers are connected. They know everyone. That quote I found of Kepler, where he calls it, what's the term he used? I forget now, but his idea of mania, inspired frenzy, right? Inspired mania. It's the idea of intention. What's the intention behind your mania, your enthusiasm? That's what's important. So he was thinking in the same way as Mencius and Plato. It's very similar. That's the thing I enjoy about reading these different books. And as we get more into Mencius and the Chinese classics and spread into the ones from India, I'm sure we're going to see the same thing. It'll be very interesting.
Mhm.
And I'm sure every culture has the same thing. They have that same connection. You know, in German, you have Schiller, who just has the same type of thinking. And it's funny, it's the poets. It really is the poets
Mhm.
who think like this. The poets who are the philosophers. It's not in logical, you know, analytic type of thinking. You know, you have to be divinely inspired. There has to be a motivation in your soul for wanting to do good. And you can discover all kinds of stuff, which we're doing, both, you know, looking at the universe, how it's made, and also the way atoms are made. The logicians are never going to discover it. Only a poet is going to figure it out.
Right.
Oh, but one question though, Jerry. Yes, I agree that logic and that it's kind of like it's something you receive. You know, every inspiration is received, but yet in that reception and then the communicating, there is a beautiful logic to it too, like a reason to it as well, which I mean, but it comes after, not before.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Yeah. Well, that's really been the fight I find in Western civilization since the time of Plato, just where he had this concept of an idea, that an idea is real, that it has its own existence. It can move from one person to the next, from one generation to the next. When you learn someone else's idea, that idea becomes yours. It's in your mind. It's alive. And others have said, no, 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 an idea doesn't exist. Forget it. No. It's either the one or the other. You have the immortal, you have the mortal. There's nothing in between. There's no ideas. Which also means they don't believe in the immortality of the soul or what happens when you die. It's just you die and that's it. It's all over. Whereas if you have this idea that there is an idea, that it has its own existence, then there's also a purpose for your ideas, right? To leave an idea behind to someone, or, you know, as we get old, we try to leave it to young kids. We try to explain it logically, but the original inspiration, you know, what's that famous quote by Thomas Edison? Invention is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I think that's what it was. But it's, yeah, you need that 1%.
I love that quote you gave of Bevel. You know, the legacy, when King left his legacy most when he died.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's always the challenge when trying to communicate this concept, this way of thinking about ideas in the way you're getting at, Jerry. Because as soon as you try to describe it, you've sort of undermined it in some way, because the Platonic method of approaching ideas is through the method itself. It's through the cultivation of the fire within. That enthusiasm is the thing that is more important than the formal expression of the idea after it's been given birth. But it's the actual, that process that is, you could think about what happened after it happened. You know, you could sort of think about the steps your mind took in going from ignorance into knowledge. But you can't explain it from that analytical standpoint. There's something else that has to do with the awakening of the heart and your intention. And the lack of that, I think, today is the reason why people have such a difficult time with the idea of conspiracies, right? We've been living in a world without intention for so many decades, in a consumer society, stagnating with no goals, no missions, just sort of moving moment to moment for, basically just keeping the markets afloat just a little bit longer. But where are the dreams, right, of what JFK was putting forth, or Martin Luther King, of ending world hunger, FDR's 4 freedoms? None of that stuff was alive. So it's not cultivated within us. And because of that, we don't have ourselves tuned to our own intentions. We're not part of a system that itself is tied to real positive intentions, except secret ones that are best left in the shadows. Otherwise, people might rebel. But people have a very difficult time with the idea of a positive conspiracy, because that's really what society is built around, is positive ideas of the future that you work to bring into being. And that's what gives vitality and life force to the organism of civilization. And if you lose that, the life force disappears. And just like any being with no life, you might have the molecules continuously, when you pick a flower, it remains a flower. The atoms don't just immediately crumble into ash, but it's now in a new geometry of change where it's heading towards decay once it's been plucked. And you could feasibly, with human civilization, you have chances to replant your roots and get the life going again. But if you wait too long, at a certain point, there's not much you can do once you get that dark age moment. So this idea is really important, that we keep this alive and transmit it. This idea of ideas.
That living, it has to be alive, and I think that's why with that revelation, you receive that revelation, which sparks a fire in each of us. That fire has to be sparked within us. And I think, like Jerry's saying, that enthusiasm, those things it's not transmitted logically, but it's spiritually, it's really, it's like a spirit transmitted spirit to spirit. Mm-hmm. Then it comes alive, and then, the logic and everything comes after.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's poetry can do that, and also art. Like there's one painting that I really love by Thomas Eakins about this lady is about to sing, and Eakins had this brilliant idea of, when he was painting, that you pick a moment, because everything has changed. You can't put your foot in the same river twice, as they say. So you pick a moment and paint that one moment that you can. So he picked the moment, the split second before the lady starts to sing. And you ask, I don't hear anything. There's no sound. Or is there? So when you look at the painting a little closer, there's the guy sitting there at the piano. He's just about ready to play the first note. And the lady, she's just about ready to sing the first note, but there's nothing there. But then you look, she's holding the music in front of her. And the way he situates the light, it's behind the singer, so that the shadow of her head lands on the music sheet. Oh, there we are. Oh, thank you, Matt. So you can see the shadow of her head is on the sheet of music. So it means the music already existed in her head before she sang that first note. The music is there. It's like when you think of a song, you can hear the music in your head. I mean, there's no sound coming, but you can follow the melody in your head. Now, does that music exist? Some people would say, no, I didn't hear a thing. And you'd say, I heard it in my head. Trust me, I heard that melody. So it's Akins is giving you this idea that it's the idea of the song that already exists in her mind before she even utters one note. So it's getting at the same thing of the idea. I was wrong. It's the guy in the back's playing the cello. There's a lady about to play the piano, but you can do the same thing in art, that you can with poetry. If you develop the same idea of enthusiasm. And I really like Thomas Akins, the way he does
Like
that.
foreshadowing.
Yeah, that you pick a moment, right? It's like Socrates is saying, you can't put your foot in the same river twice. That's Heraclitus. The world is constantly changing. Things are changing. How can you know everything? It's like, if you look at something, you're not. That the light from the sun that's shining on the thing you're looking is like trillions of cycles a second. You can't see trillions of cycles a second. But we do see. So you see a moment. You can pick a moment out of that never-ending change. And by looking at that, you can see how change happens. So you can do that in art. The idea of the moment, you pick a moment. You can't measure a moment. There's no, how long is a moment? I don't know, half a second. Well, why not quarter of a second? Okay, it's a quarter of a second. Why not an eighth of a second? Okay, it's an eighth of a second. Why not a sixth? No matter what you say, I can divide it in half. So you cannot measure the moment, but it exists. A moment exists. You can't prove it. I can't measure a moment, but I know a moment exists. I know an idea exists. I can't show you, but I know it exists. At least I trust that it exists. I believe that it exists, right? That's what you can do. I believe it exists, and I believe it might make things better. I trust in that method.
Oh, so, but Gerald, wouldn't you, that painting of the woman caught at that particular moment, it's kind of like he's captured that moment. Isn't that what you're sort of saying? Like,
Yes.
it's there, and then you will, looking at that painting, you will exactly experience what the painter experienced capturing that moment.
Yes. Yes. Very good. Because you know the exact moment in time that he's painting. That split second before she starts to sing. That's the moment, and you understand that. So you can't measure it, but you know that moment in time. You understand it. You can see it. You can think it. Yes.
Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about. A lot of fruitful ideas can be given birth now, I think, in the coming days ahead. So thank you enormously, Jerry, for this gift, for watering the garden. And
the rising tide of enthusiasm.
Next week, we're going to have Martin Seif on board for Ulysses S. Grant as follow-up to his last presentation on Shakespeare and Lincoln, which I'm sure is going to be full of surprises as well, and a lot of nonlinear twists that are unforeseeable. We're going to have Anton Chaikin after that, doing a little something on his new book that's in the process of becoming volume 2. So he'll make some allusions towards that publication. And then we're going to shift gears and jump into a new symposium focusing on the Earth's next. We're going to be bold. We decided to name it the Earth's Next 1,000 Years. We'll see. I mean, but we're going to have a whole fun series of classes that are going to deal with the science, the art, the culture, the politics, the economics of the future. What would be the needed natural way of expressing ourselves going into the coming centuries. And that list should be, the menu of classes should be online in the next 2 or 3 days, and I'll make sure everyone gets that ASAP. So with that, thank you enormously, everybody, for showing up, and thank you, Jerry, for sharing these ideas.